I'm Michael Bungay-Stania. On the show today, we are digging deep into three powerful things. One is the framework that is the deepest, most powerful framework I know to understand the relationships you build with others. Number two, the question that is the heart of building not just powerful working relationships, but powerful loving relationships with the people with whom you work. And number three, we're talking about the drama triangle, the triangle that explains all the dysfunctional relationships you've ever had and how to get out of it.
Welcome, come on in. Join us as we get curious about the impact of our work relationships on our overall happiness and success. Welcome to the Dov Baron Show, where the world's pulse meets the power of insight. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. To join our vibrant community, hit the subscribe button and become part of our global movement. With astronauts who traveled the vastness of space, to philosophers harvesting the intricacies of the human spirit, and even presidential candidates trying to make sense of the world on the brink. We explore it all. Dive into each episode brimming with wisdom from global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists as we dive into the depths of the most intriguing minds. The Dov Baron Show. This is more than another podcast. It's your passport to unparalleled insights. This week, we welcome our guest, whose stories and insights are going to captivate and inspire you. As we've spoken about many times, relationships are really important, and they're not by accident, although most of us treat them like they are, particularly when it comes to work relationships. We tend to think I applied for the job and I got the relationships kind of as a roll of the dice. It's just what happened. But what if that's not true? What if you could actively shape those relationships to become the best possible relationships? How might that impact the quality of your life? Our guest today is returning champion Michael Bungay-Stania, also known as MBS. He's best known for his book, The Coaching Habit, with over 1 million copies sold and over 10,000 five-star reviews on Amazon. It's the best-selling coaching book of the century. However, today we're going to dive into his most recent book, How to Work with, quote, Almost Anyone, which shows us how to build the best possible relationships with the key people that we have at work. Ladies and gentlemen, turn up the volume and help me to welcome MBS Michael Bungay-Stania.
Oh, thanks for having me back here. I love the emphasis you gave the title of the new book, How to Work with Almost Anyone, because, as an author, the book title is everything. We authors sweat over the book title more than we sweat over the book itself. And I have to say, this is my favorite book title I've ever come up with because everybody loves the almost.
It's the almost that's the best, man, because it's always this idea of one size fits all that often comes out of, quote, experts. This is the way. But the truth is, this is almost the way, because there's always going to be some pain in the ass individual who is like, I am folding miracles here, but you're just never going to work with me.
No, that's exactly right. That's a big part of this book, which is, and you set this up beautifully in the introduction, our working relationships are such a big impact on our happiness and success. And most of us just passively accept the hand we're dealt. And this book is a real encouragement to say, look, you can more actively shape your relationships so that you can get more done at work and you can also feel better about yourself at work.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm realistic and to say, look, there are always some people where you're like, yeah, not that person. I've had bosses, I've had people who I've been the boss of, and I'm like, we've just never found a way to click. So I couldn't write a book called How to Work with Anyone because I'd be lying. I don't know the answer to that. But this book, I think I can help a bit.
Yeah, and that's what I liked about the book. First of all, it's very small for people who want to know that, because I think you and I talked about this in a previous conversation that wasn't recorded, but we talked about how people are pretty much lazy about reading books. They want to grab something that they can read in a short plane ride. It's a small book, but it's really packed with practicality, and that's what I loved about it. It's easy to read. It's very, very consumable, if you will, and it's practical, and that's what really counts. And before I sort of dive into all the stuff in the book, I read in your bio something that I guess I'd seen before, but I never read it before. I don't know why. I read in the bio that when you were 3, you would introduce yourself as, my name is Michael, I can hop. Do you want to see me hop? Tell us about that little boy. I'm fascinated by where people come from psychologically. Tell us about that little boy. Who was his best and most difficult relationships?
Well, my parents had the same question, which is, who is this kid? Because I kind of came out of the womb pretty self-assured. And I only realize as I get older how lucky I am and kind of how unusual I am. But I was always like, hey, you need to know who I am. So my mum would take me out shopping and I'd walk up to strangers and like, hey, I need to perform. I've just learned how to hop. And quite frankly, I think I'm amazing at it. So allow me to perform for you. Allow me to show you to hop. My mum and dad were like, who were lovely and also kind of shy rather than extroverted. They were kind of not about putting themselves in the spotlight rather than putting themselves in the spotlight. So they're like, we've given birth to an alien. We don't know who this kid is. Clearly it's our kid because I look exactly the same as my dad, but it is odd. And so I had the gift of having actually pretty good family relationships. Like my mum and dad, really long-term couple. They were married for 55 years until one of them died. I even got on-ish with my brothers. But I think, you asked about with that young kid who was the toughest relationships. It's probably with my brother, my closest brother, because, I'm the eldest. And so I've got all the classic eldest brother, controlling, bossy, pushy. And
I'm the eldest, so I know nothing about what you're talking about.
One of the gifts I realize now in retrospect, my mum was the youngest of her family. And she had a really fractious relationship with her elder sister who was pushy, dominant, judgmental. And when she saw me going down that same track, she parented really hard to stop me, overly bossing and overly parenting my youngest brother. And that helped. It credit some of the really good relationships I have with my two brothers now to the fact that my mum did some really good intervening early on to stop me being that classic annoying eldest child syndrome.
Now, on the route to becoming, well, you were named as global coaching guru since 2014. We're now coming in 10 years of that. That's pretty big.
Thank you.
You also, on the journey, there's a lot of stuff in there that I would just like to, we could probably do the entire podcast on, but you knocked yourself unconscious as a laborer by hitting yourself on the head with a shovel. You mastered stagecraft at law school by appearing in a skit called Synchronized Nude Male Modeling. And your first paid writing piece was a Harlequin-esque romance piece involving a misdelivered letter called The Mail Delivery, spelled M-A-L-E. That's quite the journey.
Well, I had this realization that often when I'm in an audience, whether it's listening to a podcast, hearing somebody being introduced, or in an audience and watching somebody come on stage, when they're introduced to me, the speaker, what you hear is this kind of long list of kind of medals won and mountains climbed and honors awarded. And the experience I have being in the audience is both being intimidated and bored at the same time. Because I'm like, it's like there's this gap that is happening between them and the person, which is like they're pushing their status, which is lowering my status. And I feel disconnected from them rather than connected because of that achievement. So in the bio, which I know I sent you and your team, I've got sort of some of the truths about me, which is like, I've got a bunch of nice medals and successes and stuff, like a big selling book, and I was a Rhodes Scholar and this, that, and the other. But that's not really the most interesting thing about who I am. The interesting thing is like the journey and the misses and the losses and the scars and the adventures. So in the bio, and I'm so glad you picked it up because sometimes people skip it, I'm like, let me tell you about some of the quirkier stuff about me. So I did this skit in law school where me and another guy were waiting in the wings. The music is playing. It was Ravel's Bolero. We take off our dressing gowns. We're naked and we back onto stage and we go through this 3-minute routine of us going through motions while somebody did a kind of comedic overview. And I remember it so well, Dove, because that moment of taking off the gown, stepping onto stage, hearing the whole audience go, they're like, what is that? It's a thrill I still chase because it's that moment of performance and provocation and pushing the edge of who I am and how I think of myself. when I think of the values I have, my personal values I use to navigate the life I lead, one of the 5 values is naked on stage, because it helps me get that visceral hit of the courage and the provocation and the what was he thinking of that particular moment.
Yeah, I find that really a fascinating piece, because one of the things I'm really interested in about you is that you went from being a Rhodes Scholar, Oxford University, I think your degree is in Masters in Philosophy, I think.
That's right.
And then
yep.
you end up with a law degree, and then you become this coaching guru. It seems like, as you know, you and I have talked about it before, I'm a polymath. I've studied a very lot of different weird and wonderful things. And you're kind of a living polymath in that you've done a bunch of weird, wonderful things. How does that track? It seems like, judging by the fact that you became a Rhodes Scholar and you became a law student and philosophy, it seems like you're academic and you're philosophical and deeply thoughtful, and then you're waving your gear around on stage. You're waving your gear around on stage in synchronized male dancing. It's an interesting journey for me, just that about you.
I was speaking to a young guy this morning, 24, Rhodes Scholar. He'd reached out going, hey, I'm just kind of doing this Rhodes Scholarship thing. Can I talk to you about your journey? Because he looked at my life and kind of gone, this is interesting and a bit different.
Right.
And he was saying, look, I'm 24 and a lot of my peers are kind of pushing hard on the career stuff and getting going on it. And I'm feeling the pressure of that. And I, for what it's worth, I was like, for me, your 20s are about exploration and adventures and testing stuff out, because you're never going to have such an opportunity to risk. And when you fail, to have the least amount of stuff that's really at risk. All you're messing up is your reputation, and nobody really cares, and time. And you've got plenty of time ahead of you.
Yes.
I love that you use the word polymath, this idea of drawing from and learning from and touching different disciplines, because I do think it is in this crossover of different disciplines and different wisdoms that we build a more textured and a more interesting and a wiser life. Anything that is a monoculture is vulnerable. It might be efficient, it might be productive, but it's also vulnerable. And I think this idea of crossbreeding through different disciplines and different kind of subjects, but also through different adventures that you're having in your life. I love it when we connect and before you hit record, you're like, yeah, I learned this in Australia, I learned this in the UK, I did this adventure, I started this thing. You know, there's a quote, inspiration is when your past suddenly makes sense. And I think that's been very helpful for me, but it speaks to, so make your past be interesting, because it means that when the different threads show up, the inspiration is going to be even more amazing.
I agree with you, and I'm still interested to know how that led to you being in the space of not only a coaching guru, and I know neither of us are comfortable with that term guru. I don't particularly like it, because I actually spent time with gurus in India. I don't particularly like the title, but aside from that, how did it evolve into that from, like I said, Masters in Philosophy and Law at an academic level to coaching, and now this whole thing around relationships and how to have those relationships? Talk to us a little bit about that, because I want people to sort of connect those dots.
So I'm going to say that it started when I was a teenager, and I signed up to volunteer as part of crisis telephone counseling. So kind of a suicide hotline, if you like, for youth. And it was my first experience of being taught to ask a question and be quiet and listen to an answer. And it was my first experience of realizing that somebody's answer might not be the whole thing. Might not even be the real thing. It's the start of the conversation. It's not the end of the conversation. I didn't know it at the time, but that was one of those moments where I'm like, oh, this actually shifts how I show up in the world. Because it teaches me about curiosity. It makes me notice that when I'm at university and I'm in a tutorial and it's me and 10 other people and I'm doing 70% of the talking because I'm excited about the book or whatever it is. But I'm like, that's not actually an equal experience for other people around us. So that was a key part of where it started. And then when I found myself finishing university at last and getting into the world of work, so often what I was most interested in is in the human development of the people around me. I'd be doing projects, and some of them were interesting and some of them were less interesting. But it was always an opportunity to say, when we work on the hard things, we have this opportunity to kind of find greatness. So I'm like, how do you make work be an experience where you grow and you learn and you evolve and you become the next best version of who you are? So that's part of the mix. And then, honestly, I moved to Canada in 2001, got a job, got fired from that job pretty quickly. And at this stage, I'm like, it's increasingly hard for me to work for people. I'm getting older and crankier, and the sort of like an entrepreneurial flame that I didn't realize I had kind of somehow got lit. So out of necessity, I started my own business. And so now I'm trying to think about how do I create content and how do I have an opinion about stuff. I saw a guy called Dan Sullivan, founder of Strategic Coach. So he gave a talk, and this is like in my first year as an entrepreneur. And he said there are 3 types of entrepreneurs, 3 stages. You start off being a dentist, and you're all about the subject matter. I know about dentistry. The second phase is I'm an entrepreneur who practices dentistry. So now you realize that actually it's about sales and marketing and structures and operations and kind of a different way of thinking. It's more than just the technical expertise. And then his third phase was I'm a person who creates intellectual property about dentistry. And that creates reach and scale and replicability. And I was like, oh, I was really grabbed by that. So that was a seed around creating content, creating intellectual property, having an opinion about stuff. And then I had an idea for a book, and I started it, and then I got distracted and I couldn't quite figure it out, so I put it away. And then my cousin called up and said, 3 years ago you were talking about this book and you're clearly not writing it. I think it's really good. Do you mind if I write it instead? I was like, no, wait, I'm still writing it. Digging around, finding it. And that got me into this place of writing books. Meantime, the company I'd started, and when I started at Dove, my business model was find somebody with a pulse and a wallet and see if I could extract some money from it. Because I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I've got a polymath skills. I know a lot about a lot, but I don't have a specialism around that. But what I found was, having tested a few things out in the first 2 years, I found something that irritated me, and it was the way coaching was being taught in organizations. Coaching is a powerful tool. It unlocks greatness. It maintains humanity. It kind of curiosity is really powerful. But the way it's being taught in organizations is pathetic and insulting and ineffective. And I think I've got some better ideas around how to do that differently. So now I've got some deep experience around coaching. I got trained as a coach. I thought I'd have a business as a coach, but in fact, I don't like coaching lots of people when that's the only thing I'm doing. And so it all this is inspiration when your past suddenly makes sense. There's all these threads coming together, which is, what if I built a business which had an alternative way to bringing the skills of coaching to regular everyday managers? How do I unweird coaching for regular people? And so that business started taking off. And then I thought, I'm going to write the book that has got my best teachings in this. I'd already written a few books at this stage. I took the idea of this coaching book to Workman, the New York publisher who'd published a previous book of mine. And they're like, no, like, go away and have another go at writing it. And so I spent 2 years trying to get them to publish this book. I kept rewriting it. So I'd literally written it 6 times before they finally and comprehensively turned me down for the final time, at which stage I then went, well, do I back myself or do I not back myself?
Right.
I self-published The Coaching Habit, and then that just took off because, in part, the 2 or 3 years of rejection from Workman and the fact that I kept having to rewrite it meant that this book, The Coaching Habit, is tested and lean and short and useful. And so, as miserable as it was at the time, their very experience, I'm going through all of that with them, actually helped me bring a better book out into the market, which then just took off. And so, as you said, it's sold 1.2 or 1.3 million copies so far. And that's for anybody who's in the book selling business, you know what a miracle that is, because most books sell less than 5,000 copies.
Well, just to be clear for everybody, most books sell under 500. It's a very good book, and it's a very well-bought book if it sells 5,000. that would be like, oh, you did well. Of course, there are 100,000 books, but for a book to sell over 1 million copies is insane. It's not good. It's unfathomable.
Yeah. I mean, I wish I knew how I did it, because then I could try and get some of my other books to sell that many copies as well. But it's a combination of a really good book at the right time that caught the zeitgeist and had a little bit of magic fairy dust sprinkled over it.
So why this book, How to Work with, quote, almost anyone? Why this one now? Because I love the fact that it is small, it is bite-sized, it's consumable. But you had this experience, like you said, of being on the emergency line, on the helpline, that was kind of like this seeds of coaching.
Yeah.
You then got your training in coaching. You saw that it was being bastardized and ruined.
Yeah.
We're having a first-hand experience of the bad side of coaching. We've all had the experience of the bad side of a work relationship. We've all had that, but not everybody writes a book about it.
Well, there's a big picture and an immediate picture around it.
Okay, good.
One is, like 3 years ago, I said I would like to see myself as a writer. Now, lots of people are, and that's weird, Michael, because you've already written 7 books.
Sure.
Haven't you done that? I'm like, no, that's being an author. An author is somebody who has books out in the world. A writer is someone who has oriented their identity and the work that they do around writing. And I wrote the other books around the edges of running businesses and being a speaker and doing this, that, and the other. I was like, okay, so I want to be a writer. And that means, for me, writing books. A book is not necessary, but the commitment to being in the process of writing a book is one of the ways I'd name myself being a writer. So I got to a point where I'm like, okay, so I'm between books. What's my next book going to be? And I was really clear. It's going to be a book about change, individual change and how that works. So I started writing that book, and that wasn't the book that I actually ended up needing to write. It turned out to be this other book, How to Work with Almost Anyone. Because one of the tools that I had used for 20 years was this idea, a guy called Peter Block taught it to me, called social contracting. Effectively, and this is the key idea of the book, have a conversation about how you work together before you start working together. And that had been a really powerful and useful tool for me. I used it with the people I'd hired and the teams I'd built. I used it with clients that I was working with and I wanted to stay in a longer client relationship. I used it with vendors who were doing stuff for me. And I'm like, I want to be a really good client and I want you to be a really good vendor. And I was like, so this is a tool that I found really helpful. It is about the humanity of how we stay human at work, because the deeper teaching of this book is, how do you work together as human beings rather than turning each other into cogs in a machine? And I think this could be a tool that is used by people in the same way that coaching is, because what How to Work with Almost Anyone and the coaching habit have in common is a bedrock of curiosity about the other person.
Right.
So when you're coaching somebody, you're being curious about what the challenge is for them. When you're working with somebody, you're curious about how do we best work together so you can flourish and I can flourish as the best possible version of this relationship between you and me.
Yeah. Well, you know that's actually our theme. It's right above my side there. It's stay curious. It's one of the things I've questioned a lot and I'm actually brought in to discuss is the censorship that we're seeing now, which is crazy levels. I'm old enough, and you might be too, to remember the birth of the internet, and it was like, oh, this is going to be the Wild West of information, everything and anything, and it's become really the most censored place of all, where there's all kinds of rules around it. And a lot of people are now talking about, if everything's censored, is this the death of democracy because of that? And I say, well, I'm more concerned that it's the death of curiosity, because you can't have a democracy without curiosity. And you can't be a patriot if you're not willing to question your own government. And if you're not allowed to do that at any level, you live in Canada, you and I, and so there's some serious questions going on about Canada, not just America, but of all these countries. And it's this need for healthy curiosity, what we used to call scientific skepticism, which is important. It's not cynicism, but healthy skepticism, like, is this right? And even as you talked about in the rewriting of the coaching habit, you have to reapproach that with one of two places, which is, shit, they want me to rewrite this. Here's another laborer's job. Or I'm going to have to become curious about how to make this better.
Yeah.
Those are the only two options. Otherwise, it's just hell to sit down and write anything. I'm one of the few people that I know who loves to write, who actually believed I was a horrible writer. I grew up believing that I was a horrible writer, and I love writing. And I don't use AI, I write all my own stuff. And everybody's like, how do you do that? And it's because I love writing, but it was only because I'm willing to be deeply curious about how I can be better and how I can convey something well, even if it doesn't fit into the categories that it's supposed to fit into. And I love that you keep bringing things back to curiosity, because real coaching, to be honest, here's mine, coaching pisses me off. People asking these by-route questions and waiting for the answer they're supposed to get and then going, I left therapy as a therapist almost 30 years ago because it was the same thing. It was by-route questions, as opposed to genuine curiosity. Who are you? What makes you tick?
Yeah.
And then shutting up and listening and waiting for something to be revealed.
I have to say, bad coaching or mediocre coaching is pretty tedious.
Yeah.
And pretty frustrating and feels manipulative and not that helpful. But this sense of genuine curiosity, which I think can start with, who is this person in front of me?
Yes.
But is also about what are they wrestling with and what is a harder challenge and what's my game as well in the way that we're working together. There's a philosopher that I don't know his work particularly well, but his name is Martin Buber. And he says there are two types of relationships in the world. There's I-it relationships.
The I and the thou is the name of the book. For those of you who are looking it up, it is one of the most brilliant books ever written. I studied it in the 80s. He is a great Torah scholar. He's magnificent.
He is. And you'll know this better than me, I suspect of. But, the I-it relationship is where we objectify the other person. We are objectified ourselves. It's a bit transactional. It's not terrible, but it is a less human version of that. And this idea of an I-thou relationship, where you show up fully and are seen fully and the other person does the same, and you have this chance to be the full, messy, complicated, brilliant, exuberant, confused person. We actually all long for that. We all have this moment of having a moment of an I-thou relationship and it feeling extraordinary. I mean, that's part of when great coaching happens, is when you ask a question that really lands and you are deeply listened to as you try and figure out an answer to that. That's this little moment of an I-thou relationship.
Yeah.
And it is fabulous.
Beautiful.
And I think my assumption is in our organizational life, we are constantly pulled to I-it relationships because of the transactional nature, and we've got to get stuff done, and there are OKRs and there are KPIs, and we're all too busy and we have too many emails and too many to-dos. And part of what this book and the Coaching Habit as well is about really is around trying to find a backdoor way into kind of keeping back to connecting to the human in us all.
And that's very clear in the book. And in part 2 of the show, I want to talk about the structure of that, how to actually apply that. Because my working philosophy, and this is the work that I do with my clients and teach people in leadership to do, is understand that everybody's in pain. They may look joyous and happy, but everybody's got some level of pain that you have no awareness of.
Yeah.
And if you're approaching it as a transactional relationship, it's possible it'll work, but it will never have depth. That's the I and the thou relationship, which is so beautiful. And thank you for bringing up Martin Buber. I really appreciate that. But being willing to say there's something going on here that I'm not aware of, and if I can get to know this person, and that was really the message I got from this book, is that that's how I can get past this seeming obstacle and go deeper. In part 2 of the show, I want you to walk us through, how do we do that? How do we, as the practitioner of this, put it in place, particularly when I'm faced with somebody who I'd rather smash in the face with a blunt object at certain times.
Sure. So second half is going to be great. We'll get really practical about how to do that.
So before we do that, I would love you to tell people how they can find out more about you, about your books, and about all the wonderful resources that you have.
Sure. So the best place to go is the website mbs.works. It's kind of the hub for all the stuff that we do there. There's free bits and pieces for all the books that I've written, support and videos and downloads you can have. And from mbs.works, you'll find me on social as well.
Yeah, and we'll make sure we post all those links to all the different resources that you can find on Michael. And we're going to be back in just one click. But of course, till then, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. Now, remember, we're going to come back with part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1 again and taken some notes, I really recommend that you do that. You will retain far more by listening and writing at the same time. It's going to help your brain to ingest this and actually put it into practicality. I'm going to be back in with part 2. I'm going to dive into the practicality of how you can work with almost anyone in just a moment.